and what dance means to a dancer in old age. Simone came through here the other day. And that was really remarkable to see her. I haven't seen her in a long time. But, Rudy Perez.
Yeah.
Sent an email to Allison, like to a group message and to his email mailing list, and I wasn't on it, but Allison D'Amato forwarded it to us, and it was just like reminiscing about the 1984 Olympics and the dance festival that happened around then, and then we wrote to them and wrote to him and asked if he would come down, and he was like, I have very low vision and low mobility, so no. You know, and just thinking about Rudy, you know, I didn't know him, but thinking about him and thinking about all of us and how like really quite young we are, like I mean not all of us, you know, are all, like, there's multi-generations in the community. So that's something that kind of came up.
Yeah. And can I ask what the academic question was?
I guess like the academic,
I mean, it's all material.
The academic question was like around like our project and around like, you know, all of the problems that we've kind of and blocks that we've had just personally as we've like plodded along as just like you know, fairly mediocre individuals, like, you know, I mean that's we all like, you know, in trying to do a big thing and around failures, you know, failures to capture everything, failures to get to the meat like, you know, even just our failure to get into the archives throughout the pandemic, and then like we didn't have time really to get into very many after they opened, and what we've missed, you know, like how much we've excluded, how many efforts and communities we've excluded, but knowing too that we, you know, framed our effort very specifically for that purpose because our capacity was not to create a comprehensive dance history of LA.
Yes.
You know, so it's like what is important about like recent, like what's happened sort of in and around Peter in the past 10, 15 years, you know. This was just the entryway that we just ended up going through. And so it's sort of not so much can come up as questions, but more kind of like how do we, like what is useful? Like what is actually useful maybe to, now that this project is unfolding and will come to an end, and it is what this project will be, we'll archive it and it'll be its own thing. Like what, in terms of like, what might be useful for us as a disparate and so connected community. Dance community.
Yes. And I asked about the academic question because if it's there, then it's there. So it's all material to be used. Thank you. Do you have anything you want to add? Okay. Cool. So I'm going to use this space. Let's see, I think the spread that we'll have. Good to see you, good to see you.
Okay.
Give Jennie a big hug.
Oh my God, Jimmy,
And Karen.
Okay.
We're gonna go get you.
Okay.
See you, good luck on Sunday.
Okay.
So this spread I think is gonna have 8 cards. One is gonna start sort of like, what's the entry point? Then there'll be 3 cards that, well, I'll explain as we go. I think it's easier that way. But we'll start with one card that's sort of like where the touchdown point is. You know?
Just because I have like something in my brain.
Yes.
We do want to have photos around this, and I know that the videographer dude is floating around, so maybe if you catch his eye, if he wanders around, you can take some video and we can have some of that, or you can go and see. And then Alex and D'Amato will come by sometime soon, and so she can figure it out herself. Yeah. The mic levels are all good. So.
Thanks. All right, so we'll start with this first card. Ooh. Okay, so this is the Hanged Man. This is our touchdown, or our sort of like landing pad. What jumps out to you about this image? Before I explain, what jumps out to you about this image?
They're hanging from a tree by one leg. Their arms are behind their back. They're kind of meditative. They're suspended. They seem to be comfortable in discomfort.
Yeah. So, thank you. As we go, I might ask you for your own thoughts and feelings about imagery that comes up in these cards. So, the Hanged Man, which is, it's like the 12th in this series of sort of like major cards in the tarot. And these major cards sort of deal with like archetypal situations, in a way. That's often how people describe them. The Hanged Man comes before card number 13, which is hello.
We're doing a tarot reading for the show right now. How are you?
Yay, I'm good.
Good.
I'm good. It's good to be back in the
Yeah,
flow. It feels
yeah.
like such a long time that I was
Yeah.
last here.
So
Sorry, are you recording?
yeah, we are. We're doing a thing, which is awesome, and we like people are coming through, and your energy is here
That's
right
really
now.
funny.
But just so you know, like, you know, what be free to set up and do
I was
your
gonna
thing.
say, can I go mess around?
Yeah,
with
mess
the
around.
fabrics? Okay.
The mic is levels are kind of perfect right now, so
Okay.
no twiddling with the knobs.
Oh no, I never touched the knob.
But you can play with the volume, which is all the way on the left.
I won't play with anything.
Okay, it's up to you. It's up to you though, because I think the volume will be all the way down.
What's coming out? Oh.
We're starting
starting.
with this one, which is great, the Hanged Man. Which,
What deck is that?
this is the inversion tarot. It's really cute.
Cute. I like the size.
Yeah, you can put it in your pocket
Little
for some
pocket
on-to-go
tarot.
divination.
All right, well, I'm gonna swing back by.
Yes, please do. Please do. So this one comes right before death. And I think what's great about this, because it comes right before death, as you can see, well, maybe not as you can see. I like to think of this as a moment that's similar to when Jesus was on the cross. And he's like looking down at people and he's like, well, those people are making fun of me. There's my mom over there. God forgot about me. Like, am I actually gonna do this shit? Because I can't really turn I can't turn back around and go anywhere. So I guess I'm kind of like stuck here. And I think of this card as being like that. You know, you mentioned the part about this figure being meditative while they're in this place. And there's something about resignation that, you know, when that's embraced leads to this thing of death, which is passing to the next phase. What stood out to me as you were describing this card is looking at how these two branches are placed here. So if you see, they're like these two sort of banks or embankments of dirt and like a gap in between them. So if someone were to try to walk over this, they'd have to build a bridge or they'd fall through, or they could be suspended over it. And that's the thing. As you were talking about sort of where this project is as a project, I think there's something that's really important about recognizing that there's something really provisional about it, right? Like you said, it's not trying to be an exhaustive like account of modern dance history in LA, and you also know that it's not exactly something that's about just Peter, but it's also not something that's about this larger LA dance community. And so, thinking about what you asked, one of the big questions does seem like, how do we find these connections between us on this little island over here and everybody else on these other islands over here? And I think it's telling that this card is one of the major cards too, because, you know, as I was walking through the show and as I was listening to you talking about like what's in the archives here and what's all that stuff, like there is a lot of stuff to be aware of when it comes to strategy in terms of how does this survive, how do other people find out about it, what does it mean, not just to find connections to other people who are presently in LA, but also to people who have passed down a lot of the things that are being considered in this show. So I like to think of this as being in a place where there are opportunities to get really clear about what connections are we making to what. Where do we want this stuff to end up? Is it really just gonna stay here? And if so, how does it change and become something that maybe more people can draw life from? So I think that's a great place to start. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to ask. Please feel free to add stuff. Oh, and you might also take notes. I think that might be helpful as well. So this first row of cards that I'll do is sort of like the story so far. So I'll do 3 cards sort of like vertically. And I think that I'll say something about what story might be operative in the project so far.
Can I say that again?
The story that's operative in the project so far, or the story right now. That's maybe a way to frame it. All right. Here, let's do it like this actually, so it's facing you. I think that'll be great. All right, so the story so far. We have 3 cards. The Horseman of Cups, which is in reversal, which I'll come back to in a little bit. Queen of Wands, and the Lovers, which is another one of these major cards. Yeah? I'll actually start with this one since it's like one of the major cards. So the Lovers, is card number 6. This is card number 12. What's interesting about this one is it would be right above Death, which is the one that's right after this one. And if you look at the figures in this card, actually, I'll let you look first, and whatever jumps out to you, whatever seems significant to you, I'm curious to know.
You say, because I said last.
The hands jump out at me. I don't have a particular sort of comment or analysis. Maybe it's just something about the way they're drawn.
The hands.
The presence of them kind of tending. Or...
There's also three of them. 3 lovers, if they're.
Other things. And if not, that's okay.
There's admiration, lots of admiration to me in there.
Pointed in one direction towards the center figure.
So we've got 3 figures. We've got focus pointing in a particular direction. And we also have these hands, which as I'm looking at the hands, they're like a really interesting contrast to this Cupid's arrow, right? Which is very clear and direct, whereas the hands are like this, but this thing, but this thing, but this thing, maybe this thing, right? So, the Lovers often deals with making a choice about something, or choosing a path. If you look at this card, you'll see that each of the figures on either of these sides are wearing a different kind of wreath, right? And often in other cards, these 2 figures will be depicted as being different ages. So this figure in the middle is faced with an opportunity to make a choice about something, and it's like, well, this one is appealing for this reason, but then this one is appealing for these reasons, right? And it's not necessarily clear on some level, like, oh, it's obvious I would make this choice. Of course I have to make this choice, right? There's gotta be a reckoning with some other, like, but I really want this, but I'm really hoping for this. What's gonna align most with the hopes, dreams, fears, desires, etc. that I have? And based on those things, which are not necessarily like empirical or obvious, then a choice can be made. Right? So I think that's one thing the Lovers talks about, is getting clear about why you've decided to align yourself in a particular way. I think some more information about that can come up if you look at the other 2 cards, which are in this row here. I'll save this one for last, but the Queen of Wands. So wands in the tarot often have to do with things that you'd like to have happen, right? Things you want to initiate, connections that you want to solidify, projects that you want to actualize. It has a lot to do with creative or erotic energy. And queens in the tarot series, so there are court cards within each of the suits. And the four court cards are pages, knights, queens, and kings. Pages I kind of think of as being in like a childlike phase of like, oh, what does this do? Oh my gosh, this is amazing, let me try that out. Knights are sort of like, I'm a teenager now, so I know how the world works and da-da-da-da, right? But queens are like, okay, I've had the opportunity to explore, I've had the opportunity to try different possibilities. Now I really want to clarify what my agenda is so that in the king stage eventually, I can pass it on to other people. So I think of the Queen of Wands as someone who not only has the desire to, let's say, build a community or a project or to actualize something, but is really saying for themselves, like, I have an understanding of why I'm doing this. And it starts with me. It comes from a clarity of vision or understanding or urgency that I have. It's not imposed from the outside, right? But it's something that really feels like it comes from me. This one I wanted to save for last because I think it'll maybe build on these, but also because it's upside down. Often that means a few different things, but when cards come out upside down, I like to think of them as opportunities to ask a question. And I'm smiling because I have to turn this one right side up and show you some of the details on this card. So this is the Horseman of Cups, aka the Knight of Cups. And remember, knights are sort of like the teenager phase of like, oh my gosh, I know everything, I can do this, I can do that, da 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 da. Cups often have to do with things like dreams or intuitive knowledge, emotions, the kinds of information that remind you that things are not necessarily separate entities. And I'm laughing because there are a few things. One, there's like the kind of like tramp stamp tattoo on the horse of this heart, right? But then there's also like the grapes, which I imagine as ending up in this goblet here. And when I think of all of these things put together with this figure, it's someone who's just like, yeah, you know, like, let's just have a good time and like, let's just chill and like, let's just like hang out and like, let's just be together and let's just like do the thing and blah, 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 blah. There's a very interesting contrast between this figure who's sort of like, oh my gosh, like I love you all, this is amazing, this is incredible, let's embrace it, isn't it so lovely to have all these things, and the queen who's like, okay, but let's actually get clear about what we're doing here. Because it's nice for us to have these feelings amongst ourselves. And I think another way we can think about upside down cards is as like a light switch being turned off, or as there being a kind of enclosure. Or I don't want to say confinement because I'm not going to use that language in this context, but it's sort of like insularity. So I think there's a really interesting contrast or decision to be made between, oh my gosh, this is amazing and we love it and it's great and blah, 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 and like, what is the urgency of the thing that's at stake here? And I think because this card is upside down, like I said, it often acts as a kind of question mark, and I think it would be a nice chance to ask, what is it, well first I think it might be nice to talk a little bit about when it comes to Peter as an organization or an entity or whatever you'd like to call it. How do you imagine Peter being a part of this project, this exhibition, this archive? What's the relationship between Peter and this project for you?
Well, Peter was the first dance space that the first community space that I came to when I moved to LA.
Yeah, same. And
it was just Jimmy's art studio pretty much at that point, but it was also already a community space. And Jimmy brought me there, and there was a ballet class, and then you know, there were already lots of shows happening. And we've all done things there. I did some admin work for Peter. You know, we've all like scrubbed their floors and, you know, their toilet, and like have worked there in different capacities. And then it was at Peter where also I think I kind of had the vision for how interesting it would be to study, to explore the connection between dance that was happening, you know, 100 years ago in Los Angeles, and dance that was being made in and around Peter, at least, you know, which is where I was seeing work.
What brought that up for you?
It was Jimmy dancing in robes. And to me, there seemed an aesthetic, like, through line between, if not Denishon, then like Duncan.
Yes.
You know, which wasn't particularly Los Angeles, but it was more California, and then a lot of it came through LA too, you know.
Yeah.
The lineage of the modern that had its roots in California, you know, and the way that it was being embodied specifically through, it was the nudity, groups of women, and then a kind of propensity towards the free.
Yes.
And then that kind of, that argument I kind of was in my brain for a couple of years, and then, like, you know, not to divert too much, but then it was a practical thing. Like, years later, there was this opportunity, you know, the Mike Kelly grant. The first year I wanted to write about it. Someone else for Peter was writing a Mike Kelly grant application, so I didn't do it. And then the next year, they didn't get it, and so the next year, Dorothy said that I could write the Mike Kelly application grant, so I wrote it, and then we got it. And so then it became that we could work on this project together, and Peter carried the money, carried the funds.
Gotcha.
And and has continued over, you know, in different ways, from Dorothy to Kai, you know, from 2019 to 2022 now, has been the container for the project, for the resources for the project.
Yes.
You know, and the resources were monetary, but they were also, you know, conceptual, intellectual, emotional, relational resources, right? And but then you know, throughout conversations with artists, thinking about what the work, learning and planning around the exhibition, and you know, we were in conversation with all the people at Peter, but it didn't become apparent, at least to me, the kind of how central Peter is and is to the project. Like it's until installation, until we're here in Los Angeles making the thing in space.
Yes.
And so now, you know, that we have the Peter bathroom archive here, and we have the Peter library. We have these things, these tactile things that so many people that came through that space, and there were so many people that came through that space in the, 10 years, 11 years that it was in operation, that they all had connection with. And it evokes all of this recent memory that has, you know, of a place that has been lost and that no one really got to say goodbye to, you know. And so in a way, it's like, the exhibition is like somewhat now about Peter, like Peter is somewhat, in part the subject. But
yes.
It's almost like it's almost more like they're metaphor actually for a poetic container for how visitors might think about remembering and using dance to remember, and being in community and using dance to be in community. And about posterity and the possibilities of the future as well. Yeah.
We're gonna add something on that? Okay. So as you were talking, well, I'll say as you were talking / it reminded me of the first time I came to see the exhibition, but also when I was here yesterday, like thinking about this hallway space with all this stuff. I remember when I walked in, I was like, I can't believe that all that stuff was saved. I had no idea that all of those papers were like saved. And as you were talking just now about the role that Peter plays in this exhibition, there was something you said very briefly about the fact that, and I'm throwing this in, so maybe you wouldn't say it, but it's like, even though people were sort of like distant during the pandemic, there was sort of a remembering the fact that like, oh, Peter was a specific place that had specific objects in it. And so now there's this very interesting contrast, which a lot of dance people felt in many different contexts, right? This contrast between having this idea of this form that we do that needs a specific place and people there at this time to do this thing, and the reality, which is like we don't have those conditions, right? So then what does it mean to then have an opportunity to create a project that's both like an archive but also maybe some other kind of response that is not the original space, but is still somehow carrying it forward a little bit. And I think, for me, another way I would look at these two cards together is like, again, if we think about the Knight of Cups as this one that's like, we're here, we're together, and we're loving it, we're having these feelings, and we're coming back, and it's awesome, and da-da-da. I also think of this Queen of Wands as being like, okay, but we know that there are other kinds of mandates or urgencies that people have when it comes to resources and genres and audiences / accessibility. I'll hold that and I'll see if it's relevant in the next row of cards that we'll say. But I think there's an interesting contrast or tension, I should say, not contrast, but tension between these things. And I sense it too in like this text that's up on the wall in terms of like, you said this at the beginning, like, what are we carrying forward and how do other people become a part of this conversation, or how do we acknowledge that other people are part of this conversation? How do we acknowledge that other people may have completely different understandings and desires and urgencies when we're talking about concert dance in LA, and they may have nothing to do with the fact that Peter people feel really nice about this. They have nothing to do with that, right? And I think it's a tension, right? It's something that it's like, well, it's not like, oh damn, we have to get rid of all the Peter stuff to make people feel welcome. And it's certainly not like, oh, we have to shut everything out so that it's like really clear what this thing is. But it's nice to get clear on what might be motivating certain choices at this time. And I think these next three cards might provide maybe a different perspective on how you can think about the things that are here, the different attachments that you or other folks might have to Peter and this work here and all these things. But yeah, I think this tension is a really good one to get clear on. Do y'all have any questions, comments, remarks? Okay, so we're gonna move to our second row of cards now. And this one is sort of like a suggestion for a different story. Yes, so we got this, and this, and this. Okay, so we've got some pretty strong cards here. We've got the Magician, who is upside down, the Emperor, and the Ten of Cups, which is also upside down. I'm gonna start with the Ten of Cups.
Okay. Yeah. Just so you know, we're good. I think we're good. Yeah. They're gonna pick up again at 6. So.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. It's good stuff.
So I want to start with this card because I think, as I was looking at it, some possible resonances for it came up right away for this. So Cups, again, deals with things like emotion, intuition, dreams, etc., right? The number 10 in the tarot sequence within each of the suits is like where the suit completes. It's just like in a playing deck, right? 10 is the highest number you get. So that's sort of like the end of the sequence. And when I think about 10 in the tarot, often I think of 2 sets of 5. And 5, because it's the halfway point, and because it sort of breaks down into 3 versus 2 or 1 against 4, it's a place where things are uneven, right? So it's like 10 is the moment where you sort of like been around the circle, you've seen what's difficult, you've been through all the difficulty, you come back and you're like, I can't say I'm happy, can't really say I'm sad, but I've done it and I know what this entails, right? When I see these cups upside down, I think of them as being like turned over, like something has been dumped out, or like they've been washed and sort of stacked to dry, So actually, and we may come back to this because it's upside down, so it might be a question. But when I think about the cups being put away, it's sort of like, I've had my moment and now that's done, right? I've had my feelings about this thing and now it's done. I've had my chance to feel my feelings and now on to the next phase, right? That's sort of what I think about as a starting place for this card. We'll come to this one next, the Emperor. The Emperor is number 4 in this major series of cards, and it comes right after the Empress. And the Empress is the card that often deals with seeing possible connections between things. I think this question of ancestry is a really great point to think about the Emperor because so the Emperor is between the Empress and this other card called the Hierophant, which Hierophant is related to the word hierarchy, and it's often known as like the Pope. The Hierophant is the place that's all about rules, codification, tradition, archives, scholarly work, all that stuff. So you can imagine that between the archives and between, hey, come meet this person, you would love this person, I love this space, what's going on here, I want to work in this garden. The Empress is often surrounded by like natural imagery, quote unquote. So like, I want to work the garden, I want to help this place grow, I want to like tend to the plants and all this stuff. The Emperor's like, okay, like that was cute, but like let's start, okay. This needs to be aligned, this needs to be like this needs to be like this, make sure that looks like this needs to be like, that's the Emperor, right? Is like formalizing systems of understanding, not to the point where they're rigid and it's like you can't question them yet, but it is about like focalizing activity in a place. So you might think of the Emperor is to the Empress as a garden is to what people might call nature, right? The Magician, which is upside down. And actually you can see here there's sort of like some stuff growing underneath this table, sort of like plants and things like that. The Emperor is sort of like the first card in this major sequence. It's not really, but it's card number 1. So it's sort of like the first card in this major series. And the Magician, as you can see, I think there's some really interesting stuff going on here. It's like, down here, you sort of know like, okay, the world is a place where things happen. Plants grow, things are alive, and they die, the sun rises and it sets, right? There's this world, da, 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 da. And then there's some observation that can happen. And so in between, just like the fact of things happening and like observing them, there's the process of gathering different kinds of skills or awarenesses in order to be able to work with those things, right? So when people talk about different technologies for things, I think the magician is a great card for that. Now, putting all of that together, I'm gonna blend a reflection I have about what I've seen in the show with what these cards are occasioning, right? And you mentioned this a little bit, Jennie, as you were talking about, bless you, your sort of like you're coming into Peter and like what space it might be occupying in this project, right? I think there's something really. One thing that I think a lot of things in this show point to is this sort of romance of California that is often associated with modern dance, or that manifests maybe through a lot of the stuff that's happening at Peter or in modern dance more generally, right? And I think the Emperor speaks to that in a really funny way, and actually I think Allison's lecture performance is really great about this, because on one hand, the romance is like, oh, the desert, oh, this, oh, the water, oh, but we know that all of that is only possible because of certain investments in colonialism and racial capitalism and stealing land from indigenous people, right? Really like going in and turning the earth into a set of gardens, right? I think along with that, and I think this is where the upside down sort of question mark around the magician comes in is, okay, so we know that there's sort of like a lineage when it comes to modern dance. And of course we know that when we're talking about indigenous ways of being, the question of lineage is also very present. So then I think the question becomes, what technologies distinguish a really fucked up understanding of lineage from maybe a more holistic or life-giving understanding of lineage? And I think that's really, for me, that's one place where thinking about dance as a way of knowing becomes really important, because it's all about, I mean, I'm looking at this kneeling card over here, collaborating with forces and spirits, feeling all those forces, be it having ritual elements, emotional elements, what do you dance with, who you're dancing with, for whom, right? All of that, I think that kneeling, right? That is the process of beginning to learn what dance is and how you do it. So then you actually have to question or ask the question, well, who am I dancing with? And who am I dancing for? And how am I dancing with them? As I looked at these ancestral, the listing for the part of the score about ancestral here, and I haven't been able to go over it again, but I will say, and I think maybe this is one thing that the Ten of Cups might point to, is I think the word ancestral means a lot of things to a lot of people right now. And I think it's great that we're in a moment where people can have all these different kinds of feelings and understandings about what it means to be in contact with things that people would say, oh, that's just, you know, that's just dreams. That's just, you know, like all these like sort of like feminized ways of knowing, in quote, that people dismiss as like, oh, it's not real knowledge. Like dance is actually very well positioned to help people think about those things in very meaningful and close-up ways. But in order to do that in a way that is actually life-giving and that it's not perpetuating these same histories, there has to be a question of how are we actually doing ancestry? Because I will say there's a difference between remembering the people who came before you and actually being in relationship with ancestors. And again, I think one interesting point that Allison's essay kind of makes, and I don't think she really like goes to this directly, but I thought about it when she's talking about the Alexandria Hotel and how it has all these ghosts and stuff like that. It's like LA as a city is very aware of the past, very aware of the fact that people have lived here before. But it only harnesses those awarenesses in order to get rid of all of that stuff. I mean, we see how even around here, like things get torn down all the time, things get refurbished all the time, spaces get lost all the time, but the history doesn't go anywhere. So it's not enough simply to remember that, okay, there's a lineage and like somehow that lineage is passed down to me. Something else has to happen for those past entities to become ancestors, right? And it's something that's more than just, oh, I have fond feelings of them, or I remember how they flowed through me, or I da-da-da-da-da, right? It has to be, okay, I've had those romantic feelings about that. Let me wash all those cups and put them on the shelf. What am I actually doing to grapple with the past, quote unquote, right now? What practices constitute my relationship to the past? And once I have an understanding of that, what practices can I adopt that will undo or repair or set right, quote unquote, the practices that led us to this destructive place in, quote unquote, the present. The place where the land has been treated like a series of gardens. So I would say, to your question of, well, how does this thing continue to live? One important thing is getting clear on the practices that are represented by this project. You know, and I would say archiving is one such practice, but also having conversations with people is one such practice. All of the stuff that people are doing out on the stage, those are other practices to consider, right? The ways that people have made the work that's on exhibition here, those are also practices to consider. So taking inventory of those practices and being like, okay, well, in what ways might those practices perpetuate settler colonialism or anti-blackness or racism or any of those other things? And what practices might make something else happen? I think the show is already set up in a way that starts that, right? Because, you know, you have folks who, for instance, like Taisha has like an altar. That is an altar that's meant to be practiced with in a certain kind of way for a specific kind of purpose, right? I'm also thinking of, I think it was Sebastian and some other folks who collaborated on the photos who are in the back, right? And there's also, again, something about like commemoration, remembering, but not just remembering, also taking up so-called ancestral practices, right? So those are two possibilities for thinking about connections between the past and the present. But there are many different practices. And I think getting that information in ways that are really gonna keep this thing accountable to the urgencies that other people bring to the topic. I think the first step of that is like, okay, we've had the Peter moment and that's over. Wonderful. What other conversations need to be had now? And that may expose a lot of points where the Peter thing as such needs to be put to the side, if that makes sense. I'll draw one more card. This will be like the closing card. Do you have any questions, comments, etc. so far? Okay. So this will be the last one. You know, something interesting about this Hanged Man. So I already mentioned like there's like one card somewhere in here where it's like the card below it would be death. So if you line up these major cards, there are 21 of them minus the Fool. The Fool kind of goes wherever, so it doesn't really count. But there are like 21 major cards. And if you line them up in 3 rows of 7, you see that, you know, cards on the top, middle, and bottom rows sort of correspond with one another. The Hanged Man is in the middle row, and above it would be the Hierophant, which is the Pope card. And I think that's really interesting because as I'm looking at this, as I'm looking at the figure of the Hanged Man who's sort of like condemned to die, this person has only been condemned because they've challenged official authorities on something. And you asked a question about, I don't think you asked this today. And maybe I'm projecting, so there's also that. But this question of like archiving, I would say, just as a note to be, this might be one of those moments where it's like, okay, I've had my feelings about that, and now I put them to the side. Because archiving, in the way that many people think of it, is one of those ways where you start making gardens. Right? Because you have to decide, well, that's not going to go in here. That can't be a part of it. And the thing with an archive is that there's only so much room, so you have to be like, that doesn't belong and this other thing does. All of that to say it's really great that this de-archive thing is here with all the stuff that's like ripped out. Again, there are lots of things that are a nice start to thinking about what do we do with past practices, quote unquote. Understanding how they may or may not continue into the future, and what other people might have to offer as far as that question goes. Oh, so here's our last card. This is the Devil. And the Devil is upside down. I'm gonna ask you about this first. When you see this card, what jumps out to you? What comes to mind? What's interesting?
Never seen a version of the Devil like this. This is really, really interesting.
How is this one different from ones you've usually seen?
She has breasts.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's something, now that I think about it, there's chain beings in other cards, but there's something about the way they're coming out of this box that's really specific.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also kind of, it's uncanny. It's like a bit scarier in a way than other ones that I've seen because it doesn't look Christian. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Even though there's wings and there are horns. They're not on this hat. It doesn't feel like this Christian conception of the devil that feels played out. Like I'm not scared of that. You know?
Uh-huh. Yes. Anything to add?
Yeah, just has a particularly sinister quality. Maybe also how there's like the 2 smaller figures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just the relationality between the big figure and the 2 smaller figures is kind of
Yes.
gives you a sensation.
Yes. So I love, first of all the things that y'all have mentioned about this card, because I think in relation to this reading it has a lot of great stuff to offer. But when I think about the devil often, and like things that have come up often for me with the devil, there's a lot in the devil about storytelling. One example that came to mind, actually when Stacy did her residency over here on the stage, she invited me to come talk about the devil, and one of the things that I pointed out as like emblematic of the devil to me is when Marx in Capital is talking about like what commodities are, and he uses this example of a table. Well, I mean, the example is not really important, but he says like a commodity at first appears to be something that's like really trivial. It's like you look at a table and you're like, oh, I know what that is. But he's making the point of like, once you start to ask like, where did this thing come from? Who put it together? Who are the people, who are the people that made it? Who owns the company? It's like, once you start to ask about all of this information that's been invisibilized, you understand that capitalism works like a system of magical belief that sort of gives powers to these objects by saying, like, it just came down from the sky, and it's like it's so useful to you and it's wonderful and da 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 da. So, of course, as we know, Marx is all about exposing the stories that make commodities what they are, right? I also think a lot about folk tales where the devil will show up as a figure who makes somebody question everything that they thought they knew about how the world works, right? And again, I guess I'll use a Jesus example because, you know, when the devil tempts Jesus, the devil's like, oh, come on, you're God's son. Can't you turn these stones into rocks? Like, you can do that, right? And it's like, on a very obvious level, the answer might be yes. But then you have to ask all these questions about, but why would this figure be asking me to do that? What's at stake if I decide to say yes to that? What are the consequences of me making this choice, right? So the devil encourages people to remember that what might seem obvious is not. What might seem necessary may not be. What might seem to be the case is not necessarily the case. And I love, there are two things I love. One, I love looking at the devil in sort of a contemporary lens because this looks like an S&M scene to me. And I think one of the things that's really great, potentially, I mean, this could go many different ways, about fetishism or S&M is that it exposes that sexuality is not a natural thing. It may have natural components, but it's mediated, you know? And, you know, if you're in an S&M situation, it's like it's mediated by objects and safe words and ways of behaving and like ways of perceiving, right? So all of these ways that people relate to one another are mediated, and the devil allows you to see the connections that mediate our relationships with one another. I think the second thing that's really great, because you mentioned the devil had breasts and doesn't look like the Christian devil, and it's like, what is going on? Da, da, da. I think as you were saying those things, and as I was thinking about what it means to tell a different kind of story, I was like, oh, her story. And that's certainly one of the inheritances that Peter has, you know, like it has different feminist lineages that inform its ethos. And I think like one of the things that has really become clearer and clearer to me. Also, let me just say for the record, I don't want to essentialize and say that breasts equal female or feminine. Just want to make that clear. I am aware, yes. But it did come to mind. I think one of the things that you want to talk about archives, one of the things that's become clearer and clearer to me as I like revisit writings by feminists who were really active in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and they were really dealing with like, what does it mean to be in coalition across all these different kinds of identity? There was a lot of fighting. There's a lot of fighting. And I think actually today, maybe this is changing a little bit, but often when people have had conversations about like, what is feminism, those fights get erased from the record so quickly. And it's actually really a disservice to the variety or the vitality that exists within different feminist or womanist discourses. And I think that's one thing Audre Lorde talks about a lot is like, y'all are gonna have to fight with each other if you really wanna do something real. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you go looking for drama, but I think one of the questions is, how far are you willing to accept the fact that the story structuring this thing might fall apart? And how do you contend with the different practices or desires or feelings that sort of act as the glue or the mediation for the Peter story of modern dance in LA? I think one possible step and a way to end with this is once you start asking other people, other groups, other entities about their stories of modern dance in LA, they're gonna look completely incompatible at some points. So then you have to figure out like, well, what object are we gonna use to bind us together? And that's really where the work is. Yep, that's it.